Greetings everybody, my name's Tommy the Game Master and welcome to my channel. Well, today I'm going to be taking a look at a game that was my first foray into serious JRPGs. Sure, I like to joke that River City Ransom was my first JRPG because it has a lot of really good RPGs in its combat, but it is just a brawler after all. And although this is my first Final Fantasy, I've played through a few other RPGs, Super Mario RPG, Pokemon Red, and even the original Dragon Warrior on the NES before getting this. Still, my dad wanted to get me a birthday gift and I asked for this, and I remember playing it through on the PC about 20 years ago right after I graduated high school, and thinking about how awful the choice was. My dad didn't have much money and the game was expensive for the time. And I am so glad I found Final Fantasy VII at Walmart on PC for a cheap price, or I wouldn't have any respect for this franchise at all. But I've been trying to replay through it for several years now, since the original PC version doesn't work on modern Windows. Even had the PlayStation 1 copy I got from my sister, and 2 Steam ports that I bought, original and HD remaster. And after all these years, I have finally replayed it twice recently. So do I still think it's a terrible game now that I have more JRPGs under my belt and can appreciate some of the more complex mechanics that this game brings? Well, no, I don't think it's a terrible game. I mean, I just played through 2 Sword Art Online games recently, so no, compared to them, this game's a freaking masterpiece. And is it the worst Final Fantasy game I've ever played? Not really on that one either. I will be taking out the NES games because I think they've aged like milk and I have no real nostalgic attachment to the games. Like I said earlier, Final Fantasy VIII was the first one I played, and I played it right after graduating high school. So I think the NES version is actually probably one of the worst NES games I've ever played, if I want to be perfectly honest with you. Love the remakes of that game that fixes a lot of the things that were wrong with the NES version, but when it comes to actual 8-bit versions of classic video games like JRPGs, I would rather play the original Dragon Warrior over the original Final Fantasy any day. So taking that out of consideration and starting with 4, which I think is when Final Fantasy started its golden era, I would say 8 is still way better than the 13 series. How do I describe the difference between the two? Well, I worked at retail for over a decade and I ran into 2 types of coworkers who could be a pain to get along with. The first kind is the person who's a bit slow-side mentally, and he doesn't learn well. He usually makes more messes than he solves, but damn, he's there every day and you know he's trying hard to make a difference. Even if your boss has to buy those safety shields for the electric outlet because this dum-dum would be dumb enough to stick his fingers in it on a dare. But damn, he is trying, and he's a nice guy, so when they get fed up or quit, or the boss has to let him go, you feel sorry for him because he was at least trying. The other type of person I ran to that caused more trouble than he was worth was a different beast altogether. This person would sit in the break room for 90% of their shifts if he bothered to show up for them at all, and you wanted him to stay in that break room because when he came out, that would be when the real problems started. They would badmouth customers, purposely wreck stuff, even cuss out how bad the store was in front of everybody. And basically, in the end, it would give you 3 times the work to do than if you never showed up. They didn't give a crap. It was an easy paycheck to them until they got fired. And when they do get fired, the only thing that would make you happier at the time is if you heard news that they also got ran over by a Mack truck filled with dynamite when they left work. Final Fantasy XIII is like the latter. It's more important to show how important the series was than, actually being a good role-playing game. Final Fantasy VIII, bless its heart, does try to be a good game. It was just trying a bit too hard and ended up kind of being a hot mess. Let's check out Final Fantasy VIII. I wrote about 5 pages worth of script telling how lame this turd of a story actually is and all my numerous problems with it. So I made another video detailing it here, but I'll give you the quick breakdown now. It has a lame main villain with no character or reasoning behind her action, followed by a more central antagonist who feels like he's ripped out of a bad Disney Channel movie. Except unlike a Disney Channel movie villain, he has blood on his hands, followed by another side story that constantly interrupts the main one. Only this side story is still way better than the original because this character acts like an adult and deals with some real heartbreaks in his life and deals with it like an adult and moves on to other problems. He is not an angsty teen, and it really does tell the tragedy of a man who puts the needs of the many over the needs of the few so much that he loses everything. And if the story was about this main character and this tragedy, it would have been 10 times better. Instead, we get a character who has enough teenage angst to power at least 10 other JRPG protagonists. Throw in a love story with no chemistry. All the main characters have the same backstory and share the same sense of amnesia, and Final Fantasy VIII story is a pain to get through. And in some ways, it's actually worse than Final Fantasy XIII, as much as I hate the ludicrous terms like the fal'C and CF, and the fact that I hate pretty much all the game's characters except Saz. Yeah, when the racial stereotype is the only character I deem worth saving, you know your story has problems. But at least it was trying to get a message across that it wanted you to know the importance of being strong and what that actually entails a person to do in order to achieve it. You just have to look past that you want to force choke the life out of every one of the main characters in order to see it. 8, on the other hand, is just a hodgepodge of half-baked ideas that never really go anywhere, and unlikable characters. Not unlikable to the point of worth hating, but unlikable as in completely forgettable. The gameplay in Final Fantasy VIII suffers from what I would like to call Chain of Memories syndrome. And yes, I know Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories came out 5 years after Final Fantasy VIII, but stick with me here. Both have combat systems that are very flexible, and because of the flexibility, can be somewhat complex to understand. Not impossible, in fact, once you figure it out, they're actually kind of easy and a bit fun, but nonetheless, they are more complex than the usual JRPG norm. But on top of that, they have poorly explained tutorial systems that get in the way of the player's main goal, and that is try to introduce what the game has to offer and get us started on the quest. In this case, Final Fantasy VIII gets you into some really long-winded and complicated tutorial systems at a bad time when you're just trying to start out, and it ends up being both boring as well as going over the player's heads, making you feel more intimidated with the system instead of comfortable with it. And I know it went over my head the first few times I played through this game. And if junctioning was just something that gave you a small stat boost or something like that, it would be a bit more forgiving. But 99% of your stats depends on junctioning. There is no armor, there's no accessory, and barely any weapon upgrades. The weapon upgrades you do get are through forging new weapons at junk shops, but first you have to find weapon magazines with the ingredients first, making it a pain, and the upgrades do very little overall. With the exception of Squall's weapon, he depends on his weapon upgrades in order for his limit breaks, and I'll get into those later on. Anyways, junctioning really isn't that complicated if you stop and listen to the tutorials. Basically, as you go through the game, you will obtain GFs that you can summon into battle for really long, lengthy cutscenes that do elemental attacks on all enemies. They're handy, but they're there for more than just an attack. Each GF you equip to your character will also level up, and you use those AP to unlock new skills. The first set is junctioning, and then abilities, and then finally things that increase the summoning monsters' attacks. And I'll warn you, the summoning monsters usually like to start at the end of the list to increase their own health and attack. Anyways, when you equip one with the junctioning ability to unlock, you can equip a magic spell to that junctioning area. The strength of the spell plus the amount of spell you have in stock determine the stat increase. Equipping puny spells like fire won't get you the same response as, say, equipping spells like Firaga if you have the same amount of both. But 100 fires will probably get you more than a boost than just having one Firaga in stock. And you can get these spells drawing them from enemies. This will waste a turn, but you will get a few spell points if you need it. And it's not a terrible system, but there are some flaws beyond the bad tutorial. You see, since spells are attached to each monsters, sometimes you have to avoid using certain spells due to the junctioning system because you don't know when you're going to be able to replenish them. And if you have something like Curaga attached to your stats, it means each time you cure, you might be lowering a stat, making it a bit tricky to really want to use magic when you're battling against enemies. And oh yeah, for those out there going, well, it's not too big of a deal, next to the spells, there's always grinding after all to improve stats. I mean, it's a way out of any problem in a JRPG. If you're getting your ass kicked in a dungeon, find a good place and waste a few hours grinding to level up your character. That'll work here, right? Wrong! The monsters level up too, meaning the level of your character overall matters very little. Oh, stronger monsters do drop more materials that you can use to refine abilities and stuff that you can unlock with your GFs, and as well as to learn more spells and get other useful items, or just drawing from the monsters when they're stronger levels gets you more items. So it is useful, but you're not going to be able to just skip the junctioning. So if you don't get the whole junctioning thing down, congratulations, you're now 90% screwed. Oh, there is a 10% chance way of getting through things without understanding the junction system, and that is to summon the GFs constantly. Using the GFs have you wait for a blue timer bar to go down. The more a character uses a GF, the faster that bar goes down. During the time, if an enemy attacks, it hurts the GF and not the player. So yeah, they can be extremely useful in this end of the game. Then the GF comes out and does an attack with some gorgeous but extremely long animation. Abusing the GFs will cost you something more than any rare item in a JRPG. It will cost you the time you have remaining in your actual life. These animations, as I state, can last 2 to 3 minutes. Sometimes more, and they seem like they take forever. And dumb 19-year-olds me, when I first played it 20 years ago, did just that. My playthrough on the Steam version was about 35 hours each. Granted, I was also using some boosters along the way, but it took over 100 hours the first full time on the PC, and I can guarantee you half of that was just watching GF animations. Bottom line, the junctioning system has a lot of possibility. It opens multiple ways to customize your characters. But on the downside, it can take a while sometimes to get enough magic if you're not cheating. And just bad tutorials make it seem more intimidating than it actually is. It also has another problem. The same problem the materia system has in VII, only this time that problem is on steroid. There is no difference between these characters at all. Junctioning the right GFs and the right magic, anyone can be a heavy hitter or a major spellcaster or a master of all trades, making them all the same. And the story does nothing to add to their personalities either. The only thing that separates the characters are their limit breaks, and without assist mode, you only get to use these when the characters are next to death. And if you're nice enough, if the game chances lets you activate them, because sometimes you can be close to death and it still won't give you the ability to activate. Kind of a shame, because the limit breaks are varied by how they are used, and a lot of the characters, except for Sophie, either have to do something to learn them or acquire certain items for it, like Quistis's blue magic, swords for Squall, pet training manuals for Rinoa, and martial arts magazines for Zell. These can be kind of hard-hitting too, or in the case of quistis, just extremely useful in varied circumstances if you work on finding them all for her. It's too bad your characters have to either be using cheats or boosters or be almost at death to even get it, and even then it's still random, as it's the only thing that gives the characters differences in combat. Oh, and one other thing if you need to know about battling in your characters, battles don't give you any money. Squall, being a mercenary working for a company, gets a paycheck. You get paid a salary every half hour or so. The seed level is how much money you will get. Granted, items you can get can be sold, but still, this is a very dumb way to do a JRPG. I know Final Fantasy XII did something similar, but in 12, most monsters do drop a rare item or two that you can sell, and you can even get shop bonuses for selling the right things. None of that happens here. So yeah, Square screwed the pooch on the combat system. What about traveling the overworld and the towns? Well, here it gets a little better, but we do see some things that come off half-baked a little. We have cars we can rent if we need to get somewhere without encountering enemies, but you need gas for them, and that can be a bit expensive. You can get a GF called Diablo early in the game, and he comes with a no encounter ability that is easily learned. Or if you choose to go with the remaster version, you can hit the no encounter booster on one of the thumbsticks. So those are right away available, and so it makes these cars kind of stupid to waste the money on. Also, your first airship, which is this flying fortress garden, has 4 speed and maneuverability, and it's really hard to control and not very fun using it. So while you do gain some ability to fly in Disc 2, it's not until the end of Disc 3 that you get your first real airship and feel like you can freely explore the world. And I should also mention that a lot of my talking about the junctioning and the challenging and the magic and all that, that is based on if you play the game the old-fashioned way without any cheats or boosters. With both versions of the game on Steam comes cheats and boosters. I personally like the original version. When it comes to cheating, the magic booster doesn't turn off achievements, and it just gives you some very useful but not overpowered magic. So if you're interested in trying to experiment with the junctioning system, you have that, and you can activate it whenever you want. Both versions have an assist mode, so you can use your limit breaks whenever you want. The original version also has a 9,999 attack power up. I loved using it. It completely breaks the game. But if you don't want to break the game, I would recommend avoiding it, because using the assist mode plus Zell plus 9,999 basically means beating any boss within 3 or 4 minutes is now possible. There are some cheats in the newer versions that make the game more fun and a little bit more tolerable. Yeah, just to let you know, I am making another video comparing the remaster to the original and talking about the graphics differences between the two. But let's talk about what the original version of the game really looked like back in 1999. While the graphics now may seem to be outdated and sometimes even ridiculously memeable, especially as derpy as Squall's face can now be seen on an HD television, the visuals were still a huge leap up at the time from what Final Fantasy VII offered, which looked like an Adult Swim version of a Lego movie sometimes, with the way the graphics kind of looked really blocky. Here, the humans are realistically proportioned. At the time, the pre-rendered environments in the game were pretty realistic, and as for the 1990s, the game looked really great. They may not have looked as good as some of the Dreamcast games that were coming out at the same time, but still they were pretty good for the size and scope of the game and for the system that it was on. And there are a lot of effects and cutscenes too. Again, a bit much as far as the battle goes. Some of these animations do last quite a while, unfortunately. Now, on to the remastered. For those wondering why Final Fantasy VIII was one of the last to be re-released on current consoles and mobile devices, No, it's not because this game had some sort of really poor reception. Despite some of the criticism this game constantly gets, there are plenty of people who really love Final Fantasy VIII, flaws and all. It's because Squaresoft wasn't always good at making sure they archived the original code, and they managed to misplace a vast quantity of it, meaning they had to start almost from scratch. A similar thing happened with the original Kingdom Hearts and its HD releases. They went and fixed a few things and updated the models there, and here they do the same thing, but much more noticeably here. Squall looks more like his Dissidia counterpart, which is kind of a shame. I wouldn't have minded more of his original look, but I still take this look over Mr. McDurpy here. The backgrounds did also get a lot more cleaned up and now don't have as much dithering, a technique that made it look smooth and blended on an old scanline CRT DV, but look like crap on a progressive scan flat screen. Unfortunately, there are a lot of areas where they needed to do much more than just clean things up to make them look quote unquote good. You can tell when they took shortcuts and pre-rendered some things instead of putting character models there either to save time or space on the disk. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong here. There are other performance problems and other things I notice in the HD version, like lower frame rates too. Does that mean the HD version totally loses out on the original? It's more complicated, as the HD version does some things a bit better than the original, and I want to talk to you about them more again in another video. Nobuo Uematsu is probably one of the best composers in video games, and his work in the Final Fantasy series is legendary. The only thing I have to complain about is that overworld theme. It can be a bit dull sometimes. The rest of his music fits in perfectly though. You have this light fantasy theme when you go into a town that is at peace, especially this oceanside town, which is kind of your most visited town. It's got some really peaceful ocean themed music. His battle themes and his mystery themes always leave you hyped up and on edge. Best soundtrack in Final Fantasy series? Hell no! But it is a good soundtrack to listen to. Oh, and again, this is a point for the HD remaster does shine through, and that it does have upgraded sound files and no longer sounds like it's using MIDI. Again, I'll be looking at it a bit closer when I look at both versions. It's not a clear cut as one beats the other too badly. I recommend getting Final Fantasy VIII. Well, it's not the worst JRPG I've played. I played through some real turds recently with the 2 Sword Art Online games I just completed. And compared to those games, again, this is a masterpiece. The junction system may be convoluted and flawed, but does do what it is intended to do and gives you a fully optimized battle system where customizing your characters is, for the most part, a breeze once you get it down. But it has to do many lengthy battle animations, especially the GFs, and the story, while not cringe, is pretty bland. It's still worth trying though, but if you're on Steam and want to get into Final Fantasy, or you're new to the series, I highly recommend getting 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10 before getting 8. Final Fantasy IV is also a good game on Steam, but it's the DS version, and although the DS version is probably my favorite version of 4, it has the difficulty cranked up to 11, and Final Fantasy XII Gambit system isn't exactly newbie friendly either. So yeah, get one of those 5 games I've listed instead if you're getting into a classic Final Fantasy game. Tried one of those and interested in 8 and wondering which version to get? Well, I talked about that in another video. Yes, I do go with the standard version, but there are other reasons other than the frame rate problems that most people talk about, And the HD version does do some things better than the original, besides having prettier character models, and I do want to talk about that.